Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to OLC TV for some more Total War 3 Kingdoms real battle tactics series, this time looking at the greatest strategy employed by Gongsun Zan and other frontier commanders to defend the northeastern border against the nomadic tribes. Now, during the time of the Eastern Han, the Great Wall had been long abandoned. Well, at least the Great Wall in the northeastern region. The northwestern region, there's a lot of evidence to suggest it was still pretty heavily guarded. The northeast looks to have been completely abandoned, meaning the likes of the northern Xiongnu, the Xianbei and the Wuhuan could encroach further and further into the Han sphere of influence and take territory. Now, to defend against this, all of the northern borders were given extra powers to raise and levy troops, as well as they had a special system on getting reinforcements from the state itself, because the northern areas tended to have less population due to the raids and the farmers not wishing to live under those circumstances, despite there being forced removal of people around China during this period. Now, what would happen was all of the provinces would collect tax and send the tax back to the Han court at Luoyang. Luoyang would then raise a lot of reinforcements to go back up to the borders. Now, these reinforcements would have been made up from convicts, especially convicts on death row, who could have their sentences commuted for instead, they could then join the military and serve a period of time in the Han military along the border. It could also be made up of former servicemen or previously employed military people who were being moved around the country, as well as active soldiers who were sent up there for a specific campaign. And so these soldiers would be sent up to the garrisons, where they would then be able to support each other across a whole province, and even provinces could collect together to deal with greater threats. This meant that when the tribes raided, they could be repelled relatively easily and quickly without too much damage to the northern border. This cycle would then continue, with tax being sent back the next year and reinforcements going back out to the borders, as well as the governors and inspectors themselves raising their own troops. However, during the time of Gongsun Zan, during the time of the end period of the Han dynasty, this system was not in place. The Han court was so utterly corrupt that the money going into the court was not then being sent out into the state itself. It was being taken by eunuchs, by ministers, by the emperor himself, and not really going to the benefit of the country. So tax was being raised and it was being sent back. But no troops were being sent out to the borders. So the border inspectors and governors had to rely solely on recruitment from their own provinces. This meant that when the tribes raided and battle was fought, they sustained losses that they could not replace because they didn't have reinforcements coming from other parts of the country, meaning their forces grew gradually smaller and smaller and smaller. They still had to raise taxes, however, otherwise they would be in trouble. So they kept raising taxes and sending it back to the capital. They were still getting no reinforcements. So when the next year, when the tribes came to raid, they'd suffer more losses. Their troop pile would get even smaller, and this generally put pressure on the population. Population were not happy about this. Their farms were being destroyed. Their sons, husbands, brothers, etc. were all being conscripted into the military. And so there was a mass movement of people, basically refugees, leaving the north and going south. This caused a huge problem. As soon as your farmers leave an area, you miss the chance to plant crops, to harvest crops. They die in the fields. And so you end up with a situation where essentially you have no farmers, no food, and therefore no taxes can be being paid. This also means that if your population has moved down south, you have no more reinforcements for your garrison. And this is the situation that Gongsun Zan was born into up in Liaoxi. Now, when we talk about Gongsun Zan, he's famous for the White Horse Volunteers. This was his personal group of soldiers that he raised himself with his own money. Of course, he was allowed to, given his position in the military, in the commandery at the time, but we need to look at how these guys were made up, because it's a different type of unit than you see normally during this period commanded by Han commanders. So normally during this period, Han commanders liked to use crossbows to shoo away the nomadic tribes, because a crossbow had a greater range and a greater punching power than the nomads' bows. However, for crossbows to be effective in this type of warfare, you needed a lot of them. And as we've already discussed, there were very few reinforcements, there was a number of refugees fleeing the provinces, so the commanders had a much smaller pool of men. Therefore, Gongsun Zan thought, if I can't use crossbows, let's use the tactics of our enemy against them. And so he equipped his troops to look like high-tiered, high-quality versions of the people they were fighting, basically. He had a smaller group of men, because he was paying for it out of his own pocket for the most part, though he did get some stipend from the governor. But they were as highly equipped as he could possibly get them. Let's have a look at it. So they were given the horn bow. Now, this was the same type of step horn bow that the Wuhuan, especially that he was fighting, would have been using. His people would have been trained to use them from birth. Use of bows and arrows and all of that was quite common during this time period. Horse archery, however, was a serious skill. So we can assume that because his troops were horse archers, they were professional soldiers because they needed to be practicing this all the time. These were not the semi-professional guys who would take most of the year off to farm and only spend a few months in the military. These were all year-round soldiers. They also would have had lamellar armor or even potentially scale armor. Whether this was made from leather or iron or steel is not really known for certain, but there is certainly some evidence that later on in his career, especially when he was fighting Yuan Shao, his White Horse Volunteers probably had steel or at least black iron lamellar armor. They would have had a lot of arrows with them. They would have also carried supplies on their horse. So these guys would have also had a baggage train that travelled with them, but because they were cavalry to cavalry action over the steppes, they would have ranged miles in distance. It could have taken they could have been out for days, so they had at least a few days worth of supplies on their person at any one time. They also likely, and this goes against what they have in the Total War 3 Kingdoms game, a spear or a G. Personally, I believe they would have carried a spear because in northeast China especially, the spear was a lot more prominent than the G. However, either is highly likely. Also not shown on this picture, which is a fantastic picture from Dragon, which I found at dragonsarmory.blogspot.com, would be a ring pommeled saber, which was standard cavalry weapon at the time. Very, very effective weapon. There are some instances suggesting that they may have also had horse barding. Now, I've put a question mark with this because I personally don't believe it to be true. Maybe a few officers, and maybe later when Gongsun Zan was playing at being a general and a serious warlord rather than just a border commander, he and his core guys may have had it. But my thoughts about this are it's highly unlikely because his force was based around speed and aggression. And the more armor you give your horse, given the amount of stuff they were carrying and the fact that the guys were in quite serious armor, they would have slowed them down quite significantly. However, that's not to say that they didn't have at least half horse barding as a compromise, which was quite popular at the time in this region. So there's potential they could have had horse barding. There's also potential they could have had a lacquer shield. There's a lot of suggestions that they carried a shield as well. Now, let's have a look at what Gongsun Zan did when he came into his first area of command. So the previous situation had garrisons in all the forts around so that they could overlook the area. Gongsun Zan knew that with reduced troops, were he to garrison all the forts properly, his men would be overrun at any attack because he simply didn't have the men to do that. So what he did was this. Also knowing that were he to come under attack, the chances of another commander coming to his aid was pretty slim, he had to highlight where the Wuhan raids were most likely to come and which forts were the most high priority to guard. Once he realized which forts were ranked by priority, he could then decide how he could array his men. At the low priority forts, he likely withdrew the vast bulk of the troops, leaving only a very small group of people as scouts. The medium priority forts, he likely left some troops, a more sizable garrison, but again withdrew a lot of troops, and the high priority were fully strength garrisons. This meant that when the Wuhan raiders could come into the territory, he had scouts available to highlight where they were going, and troops available to shadow them and tell him where they are so that he could collect his forces and strike. This is an example of how he would hunt them. So the Wuhan raiders would move through the territory. As they were moving through the territory, Gongsun Zan and his scouts would shadow the great bulk of raiders. He was nearly always outnumbered. We know in the beginning he had less than 100 troops and he was dealing with raids of hundreds. But this didn't really make him afraid of the situation. He kept following them closely, but not close enough to be too much of a threat, until he could highlight where their commander was. He also then would know their path, their likely path, and so he could set up a trap for them where he could engage them in battle on his own terms. Now here's an example of one such battle. Gongsun Zan fought about 12 of these that we know of before he became a greater warlord, and before he's dealt with the rebellions of Jiang Chun, and he was highly successful in all of them, though his casualty rate was really, really high, and we'll discuss that in a second. Now, he liked to have his men split up where he could hide his main core group of soldiers and have a sort of decoy force or a few decoy forces that would attract the attention of the greater raiding party. As we can see here, Gongsun Zan and his main force are hiding behind a hill. This is quite common. He'd use the terrain to his advantage where he would hide from the main forces. This meant that when the Wuhan commander started to advance, they would advance towards his decoy force. As they spread out to attack, Gongsun Zan would then seize this opportunity to attack and charge the commander. When the time came for him to launch his charge, all of his decoy forces would also go for the commander. This is cutting the head off the snake and forcing the body to die type tactics. And that's what he was very good at. They'd charge in, take the head off the commander, and then force the rest of the raiding party to flee. From that point, he would then follow them out back into Wuhan territory, terrorize them for a little bit before returning to his own camp. Now, aftermath. Gongsun Zan was noted for overextending himself a lot during this time, especially when he'd pushed them back. So we can suggest that maybe his strategic mind wasn't all of that great, but his tactics were very, very solid. So solid that we know that the Wuhan and the Xianbei likely used his image for target practice because he instilled so much fear into them and so much hatred into them. We also know that very similar tactics were employed by the people who succeeded him along the borders. People like Yan Rou, people like Shan Yufu, people like Tian Yu, and people like Cao Zhang, Cao Cao's son. And these tactics were used, pretty much all the way through the Wei Kingdom into the Jin and used by the Jin as well until they really had established a much stronger central army to deal with the tribes in a much greater way. But, ladies and gentlemen, that's it from this today. I really hope you've enjoyed this. This is an area that's close to my heart. This is one of my fields of study. I absolutely love this period and how Gongsun Zan managed to use essentially the tactics of his enemy against his enemy, launching even his own raids into their territory just to terrorize them and keep them on the back foot. He's a very interesting character, and I don't think history does justice. Like how he is portrayed in history doesn't do justice to what he actually was as a person. Of course he was brutal. Of course he wasn't one of the great commanders of the time compared to Cao Cao, Sima Yi, or even Zhuge Liang, who I think is overrated. But he was a very good border commander. Anyway, I really hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, please feel free to drop a like and subscribe. I look forward to seeing you next time for more Total War. Thank you very much for joining me. Bye-bye.